On a night when London glittered with borrowed starlight, Miss Eleanor Wickham stood at the edge of a ballroom that did not want her. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead like captive constellations, their brilliance falling generously upon satin gowns and jeweled throats, yet sparing her with a curious restraint. She had chosen her dress with care, a soft ivory muslin that spoke of quiet refinement. But in such company restraint was merely another word for absence. Around her drifted laughter too bright to be kind, and every turn of a fan seemed to whisper a verdict already decided. She remained still. Her sisters did not stand beside her. They never did now that fortune had claimed them. Lady Marianne shone near the center of the room, her laughter rising like music above the orchestra, a newly minted viscountess adorned in blush silk. Beside her, Lady Cecilia moved with practiced grace, her hand resting upon the sleeve of her barren husband, as though she had always belonged to such splendor. They did not look for Eleanor. They did not need to, for she had long since been arranged into the margins of their triumphs, a quiet relic of a season that refused. Eleanor watched them with an expression so composed it might have been mistaken for indifference. Only the faint tightening of her gloved fingers betrayed the cost of such composure. She had once been presented with hope, had once stood beneath similar lights while matrons appraised her with measured curiosity. Yet seasons had passed without claim, and hope had thinned into something more fragile than belief. Now she was spoken of in softened tones, as one might speak of a portrait fading upon a wall. She inclined her head whenever addressed, offering smiles that neither invited nor resisted attention. And thus, a gentleman approached at last, summoned by obligation rather than inclination, for he had earlier secured her name upon his dance card. His bow was correct, his smile fleeting, and for one precarious moment Eleanor permitted herself the smallest bloom of anticipation. Yet even as he spoke her name, his gaze strayed beyond her shoulder, caught by the arrival of a lady brighter and more assured. Apology flickered across his features, shallow as a passing shadow. He withdrew his offer with a murmur of regret, already turning away before she could release him, leaving her with nothing but the echo. The insult was small in action, yet vast in meaning, and it did not pass unnoticed. A matron of formidable reputation leaned toward her companion, her voice lowered only enough to suggest discretion without granting it. "My dear Miss Wickham," she called, with a smile that cut like fine glass, "one must learn when hope becomes unbecoming." A ripple of amusement followed, delicate yet unmistakable, settling upon Eleanor's shoulders like an unwanted shawl. She answered with a courteous inclination of her head, though something within her seemed to fold quietly upon itself, as though preserving the last remnant of dignity. Music swelled anew, the orchestra summoning couples into elegant motion, and Eleanor retreated further toward a periphery where marble columns cast forgiving shadows. There she stood half-concealed, watching the room turn without her, a living testament to all she was not. Her sisters passed within sight, their hands claimed and their future secured, and neither faltered nor glanced aside. It was not cruelty, precisely, but a gentler erasure that proved no less complete. She drew a breath that tasted faintly of roses and restraint, and held it until her composure steadied once more, refusing to fracture before witnesses who, if Eleanor had expected rescue, it did not arrive. The evening unfolded with relentless grace, each dance another affirmation of alliances formed and futures secured, and she remained unchosen, a name left unclaimed upon every card. Conversation skirted her like water around stone, polite yet avoiding depth, and even the servant seemed to move past her with efficient indifference. Time stretched thin, measured only by the slow extinguishing of expectation within her chest. At intervals she considered departure, yet pride held her fast, unwilling to grant the room the satisfaction of her retreat, even as the weight of staying grew. It was then that the doors of the far end of the ballroom opened with a deliberation that silenced even the most animated exchange. A subtle hush descended, as though the very air had drawn breath in anticipation. Heads turned in unison, fans stilled, and whispers gathered at the edges of lips not yet daring to speak. Eleanor did not look at once. She had grown accustomed to spectacles that did not concern her. Yet she felt the shift as one feels the approach of a storm, subtle and inevitable, pressing gently against the senses until denial became impossible to. At last, compelled by the unmistakable gravity of the moment, she lifted her gaze toward the entrance. There stood His Grace, Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravensshire, a figure both commanding and curiously still, as though the world had arranged itself around his presence rather than the reverse. His attire was severe in its elegance, dark as midnight and cut with uncompromising precision, and his expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. Yet it was not his rank alone that stilled the room. It was a sense of something withheld, something watching from behind composed restraint. And then his eyes moved, and they did not settle upon the radiant sisters, nor upon the celebrated beauties who angled subtly into his line of sight. Instead, with a quiet inevitability that seemed to defy the careful order of the evening, his gaze found Eleanor. It was not a passing glance, but a recognition so direct it unsettled the very breath within her. In that suspended instant, beneath the weight of 100 watching eyes, she felt herself seen, wholly, undeniably, and without pity. Something within her stirred, fragile and dangerous as first light, and though she could not yet name it, she understood with. The moment his gaze settled upon her did not dissolve with the music, nor did it fade into the polite forgetfulness that usually followed such fleeting occurrences. Instead, it lingered, alive, insistent, threading itself through the remainder of the evening until Eleanor could no longer pretend it had not happened. She did not approach him, nor did he immediately cross the crowded expanse to claim her, yet something irrevocable had shifted. The air itself seemed altered, charged with quiet expectancy that made every breath feel newly deliberate. By the following afternoon, London had already begun its delicate dissection of the previous night's events. Drawing rooms buzzed with speculation. Teacups paused mid-air as names were spoken in lower tones, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in years, the subject rather than the shadow of conversation. Her sisters received callers with visible delight, their expressions alight with curiosity poorly disguised as concern. Eleanor, seated slightly apart, endured their inquiries with measured calm, though her pulse betrayed her with each careless repetition of his name. "He looked at you," Marianne insisted, her tone dancing between disbelief and amusement. "Not in passing. He looked," Cecilia added more cautiously. "Men like the Duke of Ravensshire do nothing without reason. One must wonder what he perceives." Eleanor answered only, "I cannot imagine it signifies anything at all," though the words felt insufficient even to her own ears. Yet the matter did not rest there. 2 mornings later, as pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Whitcomb residence, a parcel arrived, unmarked, yet unmistakably refined in its presentation. The servant who delivered it seemed faintly unsettled, as though aware he carried something more consequential than mere correspondence. Eleanor hesitated before breaking the seal, her fingers momentarily unsteady. As though the act itself might summon consequences she was not prepared to face. Within lay a book, an exquisite leather-bound volume of poetry, its pages edged in gold, its scent faintly reminiscent of cedar and thyme. There was no accompanying note, no inscription to declare its sender, yet Eleanor knew. She could not have said how, only that the certainty settled within her with quiet authority. She turned the pages slowly, her gaze lingering upon verses that spoke of unseen beauty, of constancy overlooked, of hearts misunderstood yet enduring. Each line seemed chosen not for ornament, but for recognition. She closed the book with care, pressing her palm against its cover as though to steady herself. This was no careless gesture, no thoughtless indulgence. It was deliberate, intimate in its restraint, and therefore infinitely more dangerous. Hope stirred again, tentative, reluctant, yet she did not trust it. Hope, she had learned, was a fragile thing, easily mistaken and swiftly punished. The second token arrived not in solitude, but beneath the full scrutiny of society, at an afternoon musicale, where conversation flowed as freely as the music itself. Eleanor took her seat among a modest gathering of acquaintances, determined to remain unremarkable. Yet as she settled, her gaze fell upon the chair beside her, where a single white rose rested with quiet defiance. Its petals were flawless, untouched by blemish, its presence both simple and impossibly conspicuous. A murmur rippled outward almost at once, subtle yet relentless. Eyes turned, fans paused, and Eleanor felt a delicate wave of attention descend upon her with unnerving precision. She did not reach for the rose immediately, though its presence seemed to burn against her awareness. When at last she lifted it, her fingers brushed its stem with a tenderness she could not conceal, and in that moment the room understood. Or rather, it believed it did. From whom, I wonder? A voice nearby ventured, honeyed with implication. Surely not. Another began, only to fall silent beneath a shared glance heavy with meaning. Eleanor's composure did not falter, yet something within her tightened, bracing against the inevitable. She had not asked for this attention, nor did she know how to bear it. Each gesture that followed would not be received as kindness, but as spectacle, subject to interpretation far beyond her control. The third occurrence left no room for denial. A sudden storm descended upon London one evening, swift and unforgiving, its rain striking the cobblestones with relentless force. Eleanor, caught unprepared, found herself stranded beneath the narrow shelter of the shop front, her cloak insufficient against the cold intrusion of wind and water. Carriages passed without pause, their occupants unwilling to inconvenience themselves for a solitary figure of uncertain consequence. Then, as though summoned by some unseen design, a carriage halted before her. Its lacquered surface gleamed despite the storm, its crest unmistakable even in the dim light. The driver descended without hesitation, opening the door with a deference that brooked no refusal. "For Miss Wickham," he announced, his tone precise. Eleanor's breath caught, her gaze flickering toward the shadowed interior, half expecting, half fearing, to find its master within. Yet the carriage stood empty, save for its silent invitation. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, stepping inside with composure that masked the tumult beneath. As the carriage carried her through rain-swept streets, she felt the full weight of the gesture settle upon her. It was not merely kindness, it was acknowledgment, deliberate and public, impossible to ignore, and with it came consequence. By the next evening, the whispers had sharpened into something more dangerous. No longer idle curiosity, but speculation edged with judgment. Invitations arrived with increased frequency, yet so too did the scrutiny within them. Eleanor found herself watched, measured, discussed in tones that oscillated between fascination and disapproval. "He courts scandal," one lady murmured within Eleanor's hearing, her voice low yet intentional. "Or perhaps he creates it," another replied. The culmination came at a ball more lavish than the last, where expectation hung as thick as perfume. Eleanor entered with quiet resolve, aware that every movement would be observed, every expression interpreted. She had scarcely taken her place when the room shifted once more, a familiar hush announcing his arrival. This time, he did not linger at the threshold. He moved with unhurried purpose through the assembled crowd, his presence parting conversation as surely as a blade through silk. Ladies inclined toward him, hopeful, practiced, radiant in their anticipation. He acknowledged none of them. Eleanor felt the approach before she saw it, the subtle alteration of space as he drew near. Her pulse quickened, though she willed her composure to remain intact. When at last he stood before her, the world seemed to narrow, sound fading into a distant murmur. He bowed, precise and unyielding, his gaze holding hers with quiet intensity. "Miss Wickham," he said, his voice low yet carrying with unmistakable clarity, "may I claim what the world has too long overlooked?" The words fell between them, at once simple and incendiary. Around them, the silence deepened, anticipation sharpening into something almost tangible. Eleanor knew that every eye watched, every ear strained to capture her response. Her hand trembled only slightly as she placed it within his. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm within. As he led her onto the floor, whispers ignited like sparks in dry air, spreading with uncontrollable speed. The orchestra resumed. Yet the music seemed secondary, a mere accompaniment to the spectacle unfolding at its center. They began to dance, their movements measured, deliberate. Yet beneath the formality lay something far less contained. Eleanor felt it in the steady strength of his hand, in the unwavering focus of his gaze, in the quiet certainty that this was no accident, no whim. "You believe yourself forgotten," he murmured, his voice threading through the music. "Yet I have searched for you far longer than you know." The word struck deeper than she could immediately comprehend, unsettling the fragile balance she had so carefully maintained. She looked up at him then, truly looked, and found not amusement nor pity, but something far more dangerous, something resolute. And in that moment, as the dance carried them forward and the world watched in breathless fascination, Eleanor understood that whatever begun could no longer be undone. The invitation arrived not with flourish, but with an unsettling simplicity that rendered it impossible to dismiss. Eleanor found it waiting upon her writing desk, its seal unadorned save for the unmistakable crest she had come to recognize with reluctant certainty. There were no elaborate assurances within, no ornate declarations to soften its intent. Only a brief request, written in a hand both controlled and deliberate, asking that she attend a small gathering at Raven's hire house, removed from the suffocating scrutiny of London's relentless gaze. She read the words more than once, as though repetition might reveal some hidden motive, yet their restraint only deepened her unease. To accept would invite further speculation, perhaps even censure. To refuse would be to retreat into the safety of obscurity she had only just begun to question. Between those choices lay a fragile precipice, and Eleanor understood, with a clarity both sobering and strange, that she could not remain indefinitely suspended between fear and desire. By evening, she had given her answer, though her hand trembled slightly as she sealed it, aware that whatever followed would not easily be undone. Raven's hire house stood at the edge of the city like a secret withheld, its facade austere yet elegant, offering no hint of the life within. When Eleanor arrived, the gathering proved precisely as described, small, carefully composed, its guests chosen with an intimacy that felt almost conspiratorial. Conversation flowed without the sharp edges of gossip, and for the first time since that fateful night, Eleanor found herself neither spectacle nor subject, but simply present. It was a subtle distinction, yet it altered everything. He did not approach her immediately. The Duke moved through his guests with quiet authority, his presence acknowledged rather than pursued, as though the room itself deferred to his rhythm. When at last he came to her, it was without ceremony, his expression unreadable yet intent. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, inclining his head with measured respect, "you have honored my invitation." "I was uncertain whether I ought," she replied, her voice composed, though not untouched by candor. "And yet you came," he observed, as though the fact itself carried significance beyond its simplicity. They did not remain within the crowded rooms. Instead, he guided her toward a conservatory at the rear of the house, where glass walls held the night at bay and moonlight spilled across marble floors in quiet silver. The air was warmer there, scented faintly with jasmine, and the absence of onlookers felt both liberating and perilous. For a time, they spoke of inconsequential things, books, music, the peculiar habits of society. Yet even these light exchanges carried an undercurrent of something unspoken, a tension that neither ignored nor fully acknowledged. Eleanor found herself answering more freely than she had intended. Drawn by a curiosity she could neither justify nor resist. "You are not as you are described," he said at last, his gaze resting upon her with unsettling steadiness. "And how am I described?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "As one who has accepted her place without question," he replied. "Yet I find no such resignation in you." Eleanor held his gaze, her composure wavering for the briefest moment. "Acceptance is not the same as absence of feeling, Your Grace." "No," he agreed softly. "It is often its most disciplined form." The words settled between them, quiet yet profound. Eleanor turned slightly, her fingers brushing the cool surface of a marble table as though anchoring herself. "You speak as though you understand such discipline." "I do," he answered without hesitation. "I have lived within it." Something in his tone, something unguarded, perhaps, prompted her to look at him more closely. "Then why abandon it now?" she asked, the question escaping before she could restrain it. He did not answer at once. Instead, he stepped nearer, the distance between them narrowing with deliberate care. "Because I discover that restraint, when misapplied, becomes a form of cowardice." The admission lingered in the air, its weight undeniable. Eleanor felt her breath catch, though she could not have said why. "And you believe yourself a coward, Your Grace?" "I believe," he said, his voice quieter now, "that I have been one in the past. I will not be so again." The certainty in his words unsettled her more than any ambiguity could have. It suggested not impulse, but decision, a resolve formed long before their acquaintance. "You speak as though this detention is not recent," she said carefully. "It is not," he replied. Her heart faltered at that, confusion threading through her thoughts. "But we have scarcely—" "I have known of you," he interrupted, though not unkindly. Long before you knew of me. The revelation struck with unexpected force, displacing the fragile equilibrium she had begun to construct. That is impossible, she said, though the conviction lacked substance. Is it? He countered gently. A woman who listens more than she speaks, who observes rather than demands attention. Such a woman is not invisible, Miss Whitcomb. She is simply overlooked by those who lack the patience to see. Eleanor felt something within her shift, a long-held certainty giving way to a more uncertain truth. You mistake me, she said, though her voice had softened. There is nothing remarkable in being overlooked. No, he said, his gaze unwavering, but there is something remarkable in enduring it without surrendering oneself. The quiet intensity of his words unsettled her more deeply than any public gesture could have. It was not admiration alone that he offered, but recognition, an acknowledgement of struggles she had never spoken aloud. For a moment, she could not answer, the weight of that recognition pressing against the fragile defenses she had so carefully maintained. I have lived, she said at last, her voice low, as though I were a shadow cast by brighter souls. It is a habit, not easily relinquished. Then relinquish it, he said, not as a command, but as a possibility. Not for the world, but for yourself. The simplicity of the suggestion struck her with unexpected force. You ask much, she murmured. I ask only what you deserve, he replied. The words lingered, their sincerity undeniable, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor felt the dangerous stirrings of something she had long denied herself. Hope, fragile yet persistent, rose within her, tempered by caution yet impossible to ignore. And then, just as that fragile moment threatened to deepen into something more, the door to conservatory opened with abrupt finality. Voices followed, familiar, urgent, and unmistakably disapproving. Eleanor turned, her heart tightening as she recognized her mother's tone, edged with restrained alarm. Eleanor, Mrs. Whitcomb called, her gaze sharp as it fell upon them. You must come at once. Behind her stood Mary Ann and Cecilia, their expressions a mixture of concern and something more difficult to name. In her mother's hand was a letter, its seal already broken, its contents clearly the source of this intrusion. There are matters, her mother continued, her voice lowering yet no less insistent, that require immediate explanation. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the Duke, searching for some indication of understanding. Yet his expression had hardened, a quiet tension replacing the openness of moments before. What matter could, she began, only to fall silent as her mother extended the letter toward her. Read, Mrs. Whitcomb said simply, with unsteady fingers. Eleanor took the paper, her eyes scanning the words that seemed at first incomprehensible. Then meaning settled, cold and sharp, stealing the breath from her lungs. It was written in his hand, or so it appeared, and its message was unmistakable. An admission of curiosity, of experiment, of a desire to observe the transformation of a woman overlooked by society, nothing more. The room seemed to tilt, the fragile hope she had allowed herself collapsing beneath the weight of betrayal. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes with a mixture of disbelief and dawning hurt. And though he stepped forward, his voice urgent, she could no longer hear him over the echo of a single, devastating thought. She had been seen, yes, but not as she had believed. Eleanor did not return to Ravensshire House, nor did she permit herself the indulgence of seeking explanation in the days that followed. The letter had done its work with merciless precision, striking not only at her fragile hope, but at the very foundation of her judgment. If she had misread him so completely, then she could trust neither his gestures nor her own longing. She withdrew into a silence that felt less like retreat and more like preservation, guarding what remained of her dignity with resolve that bordered on severity. London, however, did not grant her the courtesy of quiet recovery. The whispers that had once carried intrigue now hardened into something sharper, more cutting in their certainty. What had been considered a curious attachment was swiftly reinterpreted as folly on her part, ambition mistaken for worth. The narrative shifted with cruel efficiency, and Eleanor found herself once again positioned as the object of subdued amusement. Yet this time she did not flinch beneath it. There was a stillness in her now, an acceptance that felt less like defeat and more like clarity. It was within this altered state that Mr. Edwin Harcourt presented himself. He was a man of respectable standing, neither unkind nor remarkable, possessing a steadiness that society deemed admirable. His attentions were measured, his conversation polite, and his intentions unmistakably practical. Where the Duke had unsettled, Harcourt reassured. Where Alexander Thorne had invoked uncertainty, Harcourt offered predictability. "I do not pretend to grandeur, Miss Wickham," he said one afternoon, his tone earnest as they walked within the modest garden behind her family's home. "But I can offer constancy and a life unmarred by spectacle." Eleanor regarded him with a quiet attentiveness, weighing not his words alone but the absence within them. There was no danger in him, no risk of humiliation masquerading as hope. In his presence, she felt neither diminished nor elevated, merely settled. "And you believe that is sufficient?" she asked gently. "I believe it is safe," he replied. Safety. The word lingered in her thoughts long after he had spoken it, its promise both comforting and faintly suffocating. She had lived within safety before, had shaped herself to fit its confines, and in doing so had become nearly invisible. Yet now, in the aftermath of disappointment, invisibility held a certain appeal. When he asked for her hand, she did not answer at once. Instead, she allowed the question to rest between them, considering not what she desired, but what she could endure. In the end, it was not hope that guided her, but exhaustion. "Yes, Mr. Harcourt," she said, her voice steady, though something within her seemed to quiet entirely. "I accept." The announcement was received with approval that bordered on relief. Her mother expressed satisfaction thinly veiled as affection, while her sisters offered congratulations laced with subtle triumph. Society, ever eager to restore order, embraced the match as sensible, appropriate, and, above all, unsurprising. Eleanor's story, it seemed, had been corrected. Yet resolution, once declared, did not bring peace. As preparations commenced, Eleanor moved through them with a composed detachment, fulfilling expectations without resistance yet without enthusiasm. She answered questions, selected fabrics, and endured visits, all with the same quiet efficiency. It was as though she had stepped into a role long rehearsed, one that required no deviation, no vulnerability. The evening of the formal announcement gathering arrived with calculated elegance. Guests assembled within her family's drawing room, their expressions arranged in polite anticipation. Candles burned steadily, casting a warm glow that softened even the most scrutinizing gaze. Eleanor stood beside Mr. Harcourt, her hand resting lightly upon his arm, her posture impeccable, her expression serene. And then the door opened. The shift was immediate, unmistakable. Conversation faltered, attention turning with a collective awareness that required no explanation. He entered without haste, yet with a presence that rendered all others momentarily insignificant. Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravensshire, crossed the threshold not as a guest, but as a force that could not be denied. Eleanor felt it before she saw him, that same subtle alteration of the air, now sharpened by something far less restrained. Her composure held, though her pulse betrayed her with sudden, unbidden urgency. She did not turn immediately, unwilling to grant him the power of her reaction, yet she could not remain unaware. He did not pause for introduction. His gaze found her with unerring precision, and in it she saw not the composed distance she had once feared, but something far more dangerous, something resolute, unyielding, and unmistakably personal. "Your Grace," her mother began, her voice strained with forcibility, "we were not expecting." "I do not require expectation," he said, his tone measured yet absolute. A murmur stirred, quickly suppressed. The tension within the room tightened, anticipation threading through every glance. Eleanor turned then, meeting his gaze fully for the first time since that night in conservatory. For a fleeting moment, the world narrowed to that singular exchange, the weight of all that had passed suspended between them. "You should not be here," she said quietly, her voice controlled though not devoid of feeling. "And yet I am," he replied. Mr. Harcourt shifted beside her, his posture stiffening with uncertainty. "Your Grace, this is neither the time nor the place." "It is precisely both," the Duke interrupted, his attention never leaving Eleanor. The audacity of his presence, the certainty of his purpose, disrupted the fragile order that had been so carefully constructed. Eleanor felt it unraveling, thread by thread, each moment drawing her further from the safety she had chosen. "You have said enough," she continued, her tone firm though her breath had grown shallow. "Whatever you believe, you must." "I have said nothing," he interjected, his voice lowering, carrying with a gravity that silenced even the most restless observer. "And that has been my greatest failure." The admission struck with unexpected force, its sincerity cutting through her carefully maintained defenses. She held his gaze, searching for deception, for any trace of the manipulation she had been led to believe. Yet she found none. "I will not be made a spectacle again," she said, though the words lacked the finality she intended. "You will not," he answered. "Not by me." He stepped forward then, closing the distance with deliberate care, until he stood before her with an intensity that rendered all else irrelevant. "I have been accused of cruelty, of indifference," he continued, his voice steady though imbued with unmistakable emotion. "Yet the only truth I will claim is this. I have loved in silence when I should have declared war upon the world for you." A collective breath was drawn, the room itself seeming to hold its pulse in suspension. Eleanor felt the words settle within her, displacing the certainty she had clung to, replacing it with something far more volatile. She searched his face, her voice trembling despite her effort. "Am I your charity," she asked, "or your choice?" For a single, suspended moment, he said nothing. Then, with a motion both unthinkable and irrevocable, he lowered himself before her. Gasps broke the silence, sharp and immediate, yet he did not waver. "You are the only choice I have ever made freely," he said, his voice unwavering even as he knelt before her. "And I will not relinquish it." The world seemed to tilt, the boundaries of expectation dissolving beneath the weight of his declaration. Eleanor stood motionless, her heart caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope, every gaze fixed upon her, every breath awaiting her answer. And yet, when she moved, it was not toward him, but away. Without a word, she withdrew her hand, her composure returning with fragile precision, and turned from the room entirely, leaving him kneeling in the silence she carried with her. Eleanor did not remember how she left the room, only that the air beyond it felt sharper, colder, as though the world itself demanded clarity she had long avoided. The murmur of voices faded behind her, swallowed by distance and disbelief, leaving only the echo of his words reverberating through her thoughts with relentless persistence. She moved through corridors lit by wavering candlelight, her steps measured yet unsteady, as if each one required negotiation between instinct and restraint. To be chosen, freely, openly, without calculation, was a notion so foreign it unsettled her more deeply than rejection ever had. For years she had constructed herself within the boundaries imposed upon her, shaping expectation into armor, disappointment into quiet endurance. Yet now that armor felt insufficient, not because it had failed, but because it no longer fit the truth pressing insistently against it. She reached the outer doors and stepped into the night, where cool air embraced her with a clarity that stung. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of shadow and flickering lamplight. Eleanor sat rigid, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, replaying every moment with merciless precision. The letter, the confession, the kneeling figure before her, all collided within her mind, refusing to settle into any singular meaning. She had fled not from him, she realized, but from the magnitude of what it offered, from the terrifying possibility that she might accept it and be irrevocably changed. Sleep did not come. The night stretched long and restless, each hour deepening the quiet reckoning she could no longer evade. She saw herself as she had been, patient, overlooked, careful to desire nothing beyond what could be safely denied. She saw, too, the woman she might become as she continued along that path, secure yet diminished, her life defined not by choice but by absence of risk. And then she saw him, not as the Duke, not as a figure of power, but as a man who had set aside pride and certainty to stand vulnerable before her. At dawn, when the first pale light crept across her chamber, Eleanor rose with a resolve that felt both fragile and absolute. She dressed without assistance, her movements deliberate, her thoughts sharpened by the clarity only exhaustion could grant. There would be no more waiting, no more deferring to the expectations of others. Whatever answer she gave would be her own. She did not summon a carriage at once. Instead, she walked, The quiet streets still softened by early morning, the city not yet fully awake to its endless demands. Each step carried her further from the life she had known, though she could not yet say toward what she moved. When at last Ravenshire House came into view, its imposing facade seemed less formidable than before, as though it, too, had shed some measure of its distance. The servants, startled by her arrival, did not delay her. Perhaps they sensed the urgency in her bearing, or perhaps her presence had already been anticipated. She was guided not to the grand rooms of the house, but to a smaller space, one rarely used, a chapel tucked quietly within its walls, where light filtered through narrow windows and soft, reverent beams. He stood there alone. Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravensshire, no longer framed by society's scrutiny nor fortified by its expectations, appeared almost unfamiliar in his stillness. His back was to her, his head slightly bowed, as though engaged in thought rather than prayer. For a moment, Eleanor simply watched him, struck by the absence of grandeur in that solitary figure. He did not turn until her footsteps broke the silence, and when he did, there was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, measured hope that seemed to hold itself carefully in check. "You came," he said, his voice low, carrying neither triumph nor assumption. "I had to," she replied, her tone steady, though her heart beat with force she could not disguise. They stood facing one another, the space between them charged not with tension, but with something deeper, something that demanded truth without ornament. Eleanor drew a breath, steadying herself against the weight of what she must say. "If I accept you," she began, her gaze unwavering despite the vulnerability of her words, "it will not be as a woman rescued, nor as one dazzled by position or promise. I will not be transformed into something more pleasing, nor diminished into something more acceptable. I will come as I am, with every doubt and every strength intact." He listened without interruption, his attention fixed upon her with an intensity that did not waver. "I will not be hidden," she continued, her voice gaining quiet conviction. "Nor will I be made a symbol of your defiance. I have lived too long unseen to exchange one form of invisibility for another." A silence followed, not empty, but full with the gravity of her declaration. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate care. "Then do not change," he said, his voice firm yet unyielding in its sincerity. "Do not diminish yourself for me, nor for anyone. I have no desire for transformation, only for truth. And the truth is this: I cannot imagine a world in which you remain unseen, and I will not accept one that demands it." The simplicity of his words struck deeper than any grander declaration could have. There was no embellishment in them, no attempt to persuade beyond honesty itself. Eleanor felt the last of her hesitation give way, not to certainty, but to trust, a trust she chose, fully aware of its risk. She stepped closer, her gloved hand lifting with a steadiness she had not known she possessed, and placed it within his. "Then see me," she said softly, "and allow me to see you, not as the world insists, but as we are." Something shifted in his expression then, a quiet release of restraint that revealed not triumph, but relief, profound and deeply felt. He did not kneel again, nor did he claim her with urgency. Instead, he held her hand with a gentleness that spoke of understanding, as though acknowledging the magnitude of what she had given. In the days that followed, their union was met with a predictable chorus of astonishment and speculation. Society, ever vigilant in its judgments, struggled to reconcile the narrative it had constructed with the reality now before it. Some whispered of folly, others of rebellion, yet none could deny the undeniable. The spinster who had stood in shadow now stood beside one of the most powerful men in England, not as ornament, but as equal. Eleanor did not seek to silence those whispers, nor did she attempt to reshape them. She moved through them with the same quiet composure she had always possessed, though now it was accompanied by something new, something luminous and unyielding. She was no longer defined by absence, nor by the expectations of those who had once dismissed her. She was defined by choice, and in that choice lay her triumph. On a morning not unlike the one that had led her to Ravensshire House, Eleanor stood once more before a window, sunlight spilling across her figure with unrestrained warmth. The world beyond remained unchanged in its habits and judgments, yet she no longer bent herself to accommodate it. She had not become extraordinary in the eyes of society. She had simply refused to remain invisible. Beside her, Alexander stood in quiet companionship, his presence neither overshadowing nor claiming, but existing in deliberate harmony. There were no grand gestures now, no spectacles to command attention, only the steady, enduring reality of a bond chosen freely and held without condition. And though the world would continue to speak, to speculate, to attempt to define what it could not fully comprehend, Eleanor understood at last that her worth had never resided in their approval. It had been hers all along.